So today I would like to talk to you about death. Now I know that death is something we're not comfortable thinking about, much less openly talking about. But with the recent healthcare debate, the issues surrounding end-of-life care and dying have been thrown into the spotlight. Catchphrases like death panels, government-sponsored euthanasia, and pulling the plug on Granny have been splashed across headlines, and they've left a huge impact on the public psyche. Now I'm just curious, how many of you have heard about death panels before I made any mention of them? Well, for those of you that raised your hands, you're not alone. During the debates, 86% of Americans had heard about these government organizations that would apparently decide who lives and who dies. But what's interesting is that very few people knew that this controversy originated from something about end-of-life counseling, something that people generally agree with and have shown they want. But until we understand what the controversy is about, we cannot begin to understand why it was so controversial. So my research has centered on understanding why this legislation was controversial, and perhaps how these are indicative of people's more fundamental fears of cost containment in healthcare. Fears that, until addressed, will not allow us to have meaningful discourse on this topic. So to begin, how did we get here? Where did this death panel rumor come from? Now this all started from a provision in the House Healthcare Reform Bill, Section 1233, titled Advanced Care Planning Consultation. Now on one hand, advocates say that this legislation would cover the cost of patients voluntarily speaking with their doctors about their values and preferences in end-of-life care. These conversations could be done at a time while the patient is still healthy and communicative, rather than in the midst of a healthcare crisis, which unfortunately is when a lot of us are forced to make these choices. Now on the other hand, opponents claim that this legislation would give rise to death panels and government-sponsored euthanasia for the purpose of putting seniors to death to save the system money. Now with these two very different interpretations of the bill, I decided to turn to the text itself. And what I found is that essentially this would require Medicare to cover the cost of end-of-life counseling. Now Medicare, as some of you may know, is the government-sponsored health insurance for people who are 65 and older. Now these consultations would essentially allow people to talk with their doctor about their concerns and worries about end-of-life care. They could talk about things like, what do you want done if you're in a permanent vegetative state? What happens if you have a stroke? Patients could then write these wishes down in something known as an advance directive or a living will. They could sign a healthcare proxy to let those people make decisions for them if they couldn't. But why need this kind of counseling in the first place? And this is a very valid question. Studies from the General Accounting Office and Agency for Research Quality and Healthcare have found that this type of legislation is the missing link in allowing patients to have full control over their healthcare choices. And this is something that patients overwhelmingly agree with, as we see here. 84% of people approve of legislation that allows them to have control over their end-of-life care. Now, in addition to this, end-of-life counseling has significant benefits. A recent study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that giving end-of-life counseling to terminally ill cancer patients actually improved their mood and quality of life. So putting this context, it doesn't make sense why there would be such a huge debate, but there was. So why? From my research, I found that there were two pretty obvious explanations. The first being that this was the natural outcome of political opposition to reform. Republicans and Democrats have historically supported legislation that allows for the creation of advance directives. We see this in the bipartisan support for the Patient Self-Determination Act of 1990. However, in this case, end-of-life counseling came as a much larger package deal with healthcare reform, something that Republicans opposed for political reasons. Therefore, Sarah Palin's claims of death panels and other scare tactics used by Republican pundits can be seen as ways to derail the entire reform, not just this provision itself. Now, another reasonable explanation for the misunderstanding is the vague complexity of the document itself. 425 pages in to the 1,017-page bill, it's no wonder that very few people read it. I know that I didn't. But the other problem were it was written by politicians and lawyers in what I call legalese. It was full of implicit rather than explicit claims that only seemed to add to the confusion. I think that Washington Post writer Kathleen Parker expresses these public fears the best. She says that when it takes 1,017 pages of mostly incomprehensible language to MapQuest the way that we live and die, people have a right to demand clarity. And in the absence of such clear language, anyone could assume anything else. Now, while these two factors certainly played a role in generating the controversy, I feel like these two factors alone do not adequately explain why something that was historically wanted and needed generated so much public fear. Through my research, I came to a third conclusion. I feel that the widespread misunderstanding of the bill fundamentally resulted from the environment of fiscal crisis and cost containment in which it was presented. This is not the first bit of legislation aimed at aiding end-of-life decision-making. As I mentioned previously, the Patient Self-Determination Act was presented as a way to facilitate patient choice and improve the quality of end-of-life care. As a result, it was widely accepted by all political parties and the general public. But in this case, the provision was also presented as a way to curb skyrocketing healthcare costs. Now, if the government says that it has to curb these skyrocketing costs, it's reasonable for the public to assume the goal of these end-of-life counseling sessions is to decrease spending. Reports constantly indicated statistics such as these. 30% of Medicare dollars are spent during the last year of someone's life, and half of that in just the last 60 days. This totals to a staggering $70 billion a year. That's $70 billion of your tax money, or so the reports reminded us. Now, part of my research was trying to determine if there was indeed a media environment focused on the issue of cost in end-of-life care. So to do this, I looked at New York Times articles over the past 9 years with regards to end-of-life and cost. As you see, in 2009, there was a significant increase in the number of these articles. In addition, similar things were found in the blogosphere. Of all the blog posts involved with end-of-life care costs, 71% of them appeared in 2009. This is when the bill was being discussed and presented. I feel like this provides reasonably strong evidence that the media was in fact creating an environment focusing the public on confronting the costs of end-of-life care. So while Sarah Palin's claims of death panels may be far-fetched, what scared people the most was the context. The overall purpose of the entire healthcare reform bill was to reduce the growth in healthcare spending. Now, as I said, if the government says it has to control cost and then is paying doctors to talk to you about hospice, I think it's very reasonable for a senior citizen to think that they are being encouraged to die sooner to save the system money. Now, as we move closer to nationalized healthcare, we cannot continue to ignore the issues of cost. I feel that had this bill been presented in an environment free from these fiscal pressures, it would have been widely accepted. This is because end-of-life counseling alone is not a controversial issue. The true controversy is in cost containment. This is the underlying problem. So as we move forward towards universal health care, we are the future voters and decision makers. It is up to us to overcome our fears of death, to facilitate discussion, and to confront the issue of cost on a societal rather than an individual level. So while the topic of death may not be the most comfortable one to talk about, I do hope that by talking about it with you today, I've given you at least some things to think about for the future. Thank you.